Throughout human warfare, the taking of trophies or marking one's martial prowess is one of the more common themes. From hands in the Congo to ears and noses during the invasion of Korea by Japan, there is one form of trophy that holds a disturbing significance: scalping. Scalping saw the dead's hair and scalp removed, often achieved through cuts and brute force. In today's video, we will look at the history of scalping, how it was done, and those fortunate enough to have survived. It is perhaps helpful to start with a brief explanation as to just what scalping is. To put it simply, it is the removal of skin and any hair from the top of a person's head. More often than not, scalps were taken from the dead and dying after a battle, usually acting as proof of a kill, or to tally the dead. There were generally two ways to scalp a person. The first involved the pulling of a person's hair so tightly that the skin atop of the head pulls up like a tent. This part of the skin is then cut away, leaving the scalper with a coin-sized piece of flesh and a bundle of hair. This could be repeated multiple times. The second, and perhaps more common method, saw the removal of the full scalp by the way of a series of cuts around the head and down the neck. Once the cuts had been made, the scalper would keep the victim in place with a foot on the chest and then would pull the hair until the scalp was torn free. In the event the victim was dying or not dead yet, scalping by itself was not in of itself a death sentence. Whilst a traumatic and violent process, those who were scalped alive were more likely to die from their wounds than from the battle. The danger of scalping lay in blood loss or infection. For those who came across the mutilation of the dead, the practice instilled fear of the enemy, adding an element of psychological warfare. Some of the earliest examples of scalping can be found amongst the Scythian warriors, a nomadic people from the eastern Iranic region who were famed for their horse riding. They were noted by the Greek historian Herodotus for gathering the heads of the fallen as proof of their fair share of the spoils of war. He noted the following practice in how these heads were then scalped by, quote, making a circular cut around the ears and shaking out the skull. He then scrapes the flesh off the skin with a rib of an ox, and when it is clean, works it with his fingers until it is supple and fit to be used as some sort of handkerchief. These scalps would then be used to decorate the warrior's horse as a sign of his previous conquests and his prowess as a fighter. Scalping, however, is more well known as a practice in the Americas. There is archaeological evidence to suggest that scalping was carried out as early as the 1300s by Native American tribes. Some 486 bodies of men, women and children were found in a mass grave in what is called the Crow Creek Massacre. Where skulls were found, 90% bore evidence of being scalped, with a telltale cut showing where the victim's scalp had been cut away. When European settlers and colonialists arrived in the Americas, they noticed examples of scalps being claimed during intertribal conflicts. They noted the way in which scalps were decorative figures and symbols of martial prowess, and how the scalps were ritually dried. Not all of the tribes engaged in this practice, with some placing differing value on the use of scalps. It would not take long for the European settlers to offer bounties for the scalps of Native American tribes, with whom they were not on good terms with. Useful supplies and materials were first traded with friendly tribes for the scalps of enemy tribes, but this would soon evolve into offering cash bounties for the scalps. One notable example was in 1755, when the Massachusetts governor issued a decree offering a monetary reward for scalps. Dozens of similar bounty proclamations were made, encouraging the scalping and killing of Native American tribes by frontiersmen, soldiers, and rival tribes. What was seen previously as an exclusive Native American practice became part of policy for Europeans dealing with the Indian tribes on the frontier. This monetization of scalping is thought by some to have encouraged the practice, though exact figures for those cashing in the bounties is hard to determine. During the American Revolutionary War, both sides in the conflict sought to propagandize the use of Native American soldiers in the conflict. Both sides sought to paint the other as engaging in scalping as part of the war effort. Whilst many tribes sought to keep out of the conflict, some joined in, acting as either scouts or raiders. British Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton earned the nickname Hair Buyer for reportedly paying Native Americans for the scalping of patriots. There is, however, little in the way of evidence for this. Both sides, the Patriots and the English, reportedly engaged in some level of scalping, with rumours of scalping taking place at Concord against British troops. Scalping played a major role of the American Indian Wars that defined the displacement and genocide of the Native Americans, whereby scalps were taken by both sides as proof of kills. During the Sand Creek Massacre, where around 150 Native Americans were killed, around 2/3 of those were women and children. The attack was carried out by the 3rd Colorado Cavalry under the command of Colonel John Chivington. All manner of mutilations were carried out, and more grisly trophies were taken, including fetuses and female genitals. But not every man in the unit engaged in the attack and barbarity, with Captain Silas Sewell and some 150 men refusing Chivington's orders to attack the Cheyenne and Arapaho in their camp. Sewell went on to testify against Chivington, though those who engaged in such cruelty never saw any justice. For those on the American frontier, constant battles with Native Americans saw scalping used by such tribes. The practice was widespread, but not every instance was carried out upon a dead person. One of the more famous survivors of scalping was Robert McGee. In 1864, the 14-year-old orphan was working in a wagon train. Whilst travelling to Fort Union in New Mexico delivering supplies, the convoy was attacked multiple times by the Sioux tribe. Thanks to a military escort, the train made it a few miles from Fort Union unharmed, becoming somewhat complacent and allowing their military escort to drop off far behind them. It was when the train was camped for the night that the Sioux warriors struck, raining down arrows and firing pistols into the wagon handlers. Led reportedly by Chief Little Turtle, the wagon train was no match, and many of the men were slaughtered. The 14-year-old McGee recalls being shot by arrows and pistols, clinging onto life when Little Turtle scalped him. 64 inches of flesh was removed while McGee lay in the dirt. When their military escort caught up, they were presented with the site of the massacre, realizing only 2 young teenagers were clinging to life, one of whom would not survive long. Despite his numerous wounds, McGee would be the only survivor of the attack. All manner of attempts were made to give McGee hair, but none proved successful. The now famous photograph of the 39-year-old McGee remains a stark reminder of the brutality of scalping. McGee became somewhat of a celebrity, with his story being exaggerated more than it needed to be, with some insisting that he was the only survivor of scalping. There are, however, other known survivors of scalping, notably Josiah Wilberger. Wilberger was a frontiersman who in 1833 was attacked by a group of Comanche Indians. He and his companions were vastly outnumbered and gravely wounded. All were scalped, with Wilberger conscious for the whole ordeal. He recalled feeling no pain, but that the removal sounded like the peal of distant thunder. Wilberger managed to regain his strength, and he was eventually rescued. His head never fully healed due to the exposure to the sun. He lived for another 11 years, though his scalp wound was believed to have contributed to his death. Wilberger had banged his exposed skull against a door frame, exposing his brain, dying in 1845. As the American Indian War drew to a close, incidents of scalping faded too. Widespread scalping is no longer a practice that really exists, though the mutilation of the dead is something that will no doubt continue in other forms. Nevertheless, scalping remains part of popular culture, playing a key role in cowboy and Indian films, and even in the odd Tarantino film. It is one of the grim examples of taking trophies from humans, and of the mutilation of the enemy. It is one that played a part in the early history of the United States of America, and the disturbing violence that was often inflicted during this time.